Hello class, today we're going to go ahead and take a look at section 5.2, factoring by grouping. This particular type of grouping doesn't initially have a GCF, so that's the main difference between this and our previous section, section 5.1. We are going to notice something that is a little bit different on these. Typically they're going to have 4 terms to them. And you'll notice right away that they're not going to have a GCF in common. For example, if we take a look at 1a right there, you notice that as part of your coefficients here, you have a 1, you have a -2, a 3, and a 6. Well, you're going to notice that you're not going to be able to factor out a coefficient due to it not being divisible. For example, the 2 and the 6, yes, you could divide them by 2, but you cannot divide the 3 by 2. Same thing goes with the variables. These have x's, except the last 2 terms don't have x. Same thing with the y. These 2 terms have y, but these 2 don't. So what you're going to have to do here is, and just like the title says, grouping, you're going to have to go ahead and group the first 2 pairs and the last 2 pairs. And you're going to treat them individually, and from there you're going to go ahead and factor out the GCF. Now keep in mind the GCF could be a number, essentially your coefficient, a variable, a combination of those two, or a polynomial. So we're going to take all of that into account, all the stuff that we covered in section 5.1. So in this particular example, if we ignore the second part right there, these 2 terms have in common the x. So we're going to go ahead and factor out the x. So we factor out the x and we end up with y minus 2. Now the idea here is that we should end up with the same polynomial for that second pair. So if you cover this up, both of these terms have the 3 in common. So we factor out the 3. 3 goes into 3 once, so it's 1y or simply y. And -6 divided by 3 will be -2. And that's the whole idea, to end up with a polynomial that you have the same. In other words, you're going to have to factor out twice here. First you group them, then see what GCF they have in common. And then now you see that both of these have what? The y minus 2 in common. So that's what we're going to have to factor out next. So if we go ahead and take a look at this, we factor out the y minus 2 from both of them. So you end up with x here, and you end up with plus 3 here. And that would be your answer for that one right there. So once again, it's not a difficult. You're just going to have to learn this new technique that we're going to have to group them, since there's not anything initially that they have in common. Let's take a look at another example. If we take a look at B right there. So now letter B there, it says that a to the third minus 4a squared plus 2a minus 8. Once again, like I stated before, you really don't have any GCF in common in all of them, especially the number or the variable. These 3 have a's, but this one doesn't. So we're going to group them. We're going to group the first pair, and we're going to group the last pair. So now you're going to go ahead and take the GCF for the first pair. And once again, cover this up. And right there, we take a look that both of them have an a in common. In this case, you're going to factor out the smallest power. In this case, will be a squared. So you factor out a squared from the first pair. So you factor it out from a to the third, you're left with a. You factor it out from here, you're left with minus 4. So that takes care of the first 2. We're going to do the same thing for the last 2. In this case, both of these have the coefficient in common, which is 2. In other words, those 2 coefficients, the 2 and the 8, have the 2 in common, so that's what we're going to have to factor out. So 2 divided by 2 is 1a, or simply a. And -8 divided by 2 will be -4. And you see the same pattern happening here. Both of them now have that polynomial a minus 4 in common. So we're going to go ahead and factor that out. So we factor out a minus 4 from the first term. And remember, it's this whole thing right here. So this will give you a squared. And we're going to go ahead and factor it out from this term, which will leave plus 2. In other words, you're picking it out. You're picking out a minus 4 from here. You're picking out a minus 4 from there. So the whole thing is your answer. Obviously, once again, you're going to have to factor out by grouping. You're going to have to pair them off in this case. So once again, take your time on these. If you have to rewind, rewind. But that's the whole idea right there. If we take a look at our next example, it's going to get a little bit more complex. We have larger numbers in common, but the same idea happens here. We do not have a common GCF for all of them. Remember, when it's a GCF, it has to be all or nothing. So here we're going to go ahead and pair off the first two, and we're going to pair off the last two. For the first pair, we see that we have a 15 and a 12. Well, what is the GCF of 15 and 12? Both of those numbers could be divisible by 3. Same thing that we did before. These two have the variables in common, in this case the x. So we're going to factor out the x. So 15 divided by 3 would be 5. If we factor x from x squared, we're left with x. 12 divided by 3, that'll be 4. And then we factored out the x, so we leave it alone. So that takes care of the first pair. We're going to do the same thing for the second pair. You have negative 25 and you have negative 20. Now you're going to notice that obviously both of these have the 5 in common, but you notice that that middle term, in this case the negative 25, you have that negative sign there. It is imperative that you factor out the negative on this one, because remember, we want to end up with the same thing. So if we factor out negative 5 here, so negative 25 divided by negative 5 will give you positive 5x. That's the reason why you want to end up factoring a negative 5. If you don't do that, then this one would have been negative 5x, which will not be the same as what we have here. Do the same thing for the second term. Negative 20 divided by negative 5, that'll give you positive 4. And you see that both of these polynomials are the same. It is very rare that you'll see polynomials that are different when you're doing factoring by grouping. They do occur, but I don't think we're going to experience one of them in this particular section. So now that we know that both of them have the 5x plus 4 in common, we're going to go ahead and factor that out. So we factor out the 5x plus 4 for that first term right there. Remember, you're picking it out. So you're left with 3x. And we're going to do the same thing for the second term, this whole thing right here. So you're left with minus 5. And once again, it's the whole thing that is your answer right there. 5x plus 4, 3x minus 5. All right, so once again, it is not difficult. You just have to go ahead and concentrate on what they have in common, and especially remember that you're going to have to pair them off. But what if we have different variables? Well, same idea. You're first going to take a look at your numbers. So here we could pair off these two, and we could pair off those two. So once again, that's why it's called grouping. You group the first two terms, you group the last two terms. Both of these have obviously the 5 in common, so that'll be your GCF as far as the number is concerned. But you also have variables. In this case, going in alphabetical order, you have A here and you have A here. So you're going to factor out the smallest of those two. In this case, the A squared. Now you may be asking, how about the B? Well, we can't factor out the B because this one does not have a B. So the only thing that you're going to factor out is 5A squared. So what we're going to do here is we're going to divide 15 divided by 5, which will be 3. Factor out A squared from A to the third, so we're left with A. The same thing over here, negative 25 divided by 5. is negative 5. And we factored out the a squared completely, so we're not going to have an a left. So we're only going to have the b left. We repeat the same process all over again with this one. In this case, we have 6 and 10. But remember, we have that negative there. So 6 and 10 have the 2 in common. But we're going to factor out the negative 2. And let me scratch out this. And both of these also have in common the b. So you're going to factor out the smallest power of the b, which is b squared. So that's your GCF, negative 2b squared. You're not going to factor out an a because this one does not have an a. So once again, negative 2 divided by negative 6 divided by negative 2, is positive 3. You factor out b squared, so you're left with a. And 10 divided by negative 2, once again, that'll give you negative 5. And if you factor out b squared from b to the third, you're left with b. So once again, you see that both of them have in common the 3a minus 5b. So that's the next part that we're going to factor out. So if we factor out 3a minus 5b, that's their common polynomial here. So if you factor it out from here, you're left with 5a squared. If you factor it out from here, you're left with minus 2b squared. Now once again, it's like if you're going in there with your hand and you're picking it out. You're taking it out right there. So once again, this will be your final answer. And this goes ahead and concludes part 1 of section 5.2. See you in part 2 in a little bit.